Hey guys, tonight we begin with one of history's cruelest paradoxes. Imagine being free in a land built on slavery. Imagine having papers that say you belong to yourself, while everyone around you insists you belong to someone, somewhere, somehow. We're stepping into the lives of free black people in the Antebellum South, that strange and terrifying period before the Civil War, when roughly 250,000 black Americans lived technically free in states that considered their very existence a threat to the social order. These weren't runaways hiding in swamps. These were legally free citizens, some born free, some who had purchased their own bodies, some manumitted by guilty or dying enslavers. And their lives were a daily navigation of dangers that make modern anxieties look quaint by comparison. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you're free. You have the papers to prove it, folded carefully in your pocket, worn soft at the creases from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times. Maybe your grandmother was freed by an enslaver who had a crisis of conscience on his deathbed. Maybe your mother saved for 20 years, hiring herself out on Sundays, scraping together enough coin to purchase her own flesh from the man who claimed to own it. Maybe you were born to parents who were already free, which makes you one of the lucky ones, though lucky is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that sentence. Either way, you're not enslaved. You can't be sold. You can't be whipped at another man's pleasure. You can't be separated from your family on a Tuesday because someone needed cash. The good news ends there. Because being free and being safe are two entirely different things. And in the Antebellum South, free black people learned that distinction the hard way, every single day, from the moment they woke up until the moment they managed to fall into an uneasy sleep. Let's start with the papers, because those papers are your life. Without them, you're presumed to be an escaped slave. With them, you're merely a suspicious anomaly that makes white people uncomfortable. Your freedom papers need to be registered with the local court, which means white officials know exactly who you are, where you live, and that you exist in a category they find philosophically troubling. Every time you travel, even to the next county, you need to carry those papers. Every time a white person demands to see them, you need to produce them immediately, with a smile, with deference, with gratitude for being allowed to prove you're not property. If your papers get lost, stolen, damaged, or destroyed, you have a serious problem. Replacing them requires going back to court, finding witnesses who can testify to your status, paying fees you probably can't afford, and hoping the judge is in a generous mood, rather than the mood that says maybe this one should be sold for the county's benefit. Some free black people carried multiple copies. Some memorized the exact wording so they could recite it if needed. Some sewed papers into the linings of their clothes. The paranoia was justified. Without documentation, freedom evaporated like morning fog. Here's where it gets really precarious. The entire Southern economy depended on slavery, and free black people represented a living contradiction to the ideology that made slavery possible. If black people could be free, could work, could own property, could raise families, could exist as human beings rather than livestock, then maybe the whole system was built on a lie. That possibility made white Southerners deeply uncomfortable. And when white Southerners got uncomfortable, black people suffered. The slavocracy needed everyone to believe that black people were inherently inferior, naturally suited for bondage, incapable of self-governance. Every free black person who worked hard, raised a family, stayed out of trouble, and lived a respectable life was a walking refutation of that ideology. And ideologies under threat tend to produce desperate measures. So the laws governing free black lives were designed to make freedom as miserable as possible without technically being slavery. You couldn't vote, obviously. The ballot box was for white men only, and your opinions on governance were not requested. You couldn't testify against white people in court, which meant any white person could rob you, assault you, or destroy your property with near impunity. If a white man walked into your shop, took what he wanted, and walked out without paying, your only recourse was to find another white person willing to testify on your behalf, which was roughly as likely as finding gold in your breakfast porridge. You couldn't own firearms in most places, leaving you defenseless against the very people most likely to harm you. You couldn't gather in groups without white supervision, because apparently free black people sitting around talking was a threat to civilization itself. 3 black men discussing the weather might be plotting rebellion, as far as white authorities were concerned. You couldn't learn to read in some states, and you definitely couldn't teach other black people to read, because literacy was power, and power was dangerous in the wrong hands. You couldn't preach without a license, and licenses were hard to get and easy to revoke, because the authorities worried about what you might say and who might listen. You couldn't own certain types of property in certain places. You couldn't enter certain professions. You couldn't travel freely. You couldn't marry who you wanted, at least not legally, not in ways the state would recognize. You were free, technically, but freedom came with an asterisk the size of a plantation, and the fine print went on for pages. Now imagine trying to make a living under these conditions. You wake up in whatever cramped room or small house you've managed to secure, and you need to work because nobody's providing for you. Unlike enslaved people who were fed and housed by their enslavers, however inadequately, you were on your own. Your meals depended on your earnings. Your shelter depended on your rent. Every expense came out of your own pocket, and your pocket had holes in it that the law kept cutting wider. But the jobs available to free black people were limited by law and custom to the lowest rungs of the economy. You could be a laborer, hauling and lifting until your back gave out, competing with enslaved workers who could be hired out for less than you needed to survive. You could be a domestic servant, cleaning white people's houses and raising white people's children, invisible in their homes while being indispensable to their comfort. You could work on the docks, loading and unloading ships in the blistering heat, surrounded by enslaved workers doing the same jobs, the line between free and enslaved blurring in the sweat and exhaustion. You could be a craftsman if you'd somehow acquired a skill, a blacksmith or carpenter or barber or shoemaker, but even then you faced restrictions that white craftsmen didn't face. Some cities required you to have a white guardian or sponsor who would vouch for your behavior and your business practices. Some states prohibited you from certain trades entirely, protecting white workers from the competition of black workers who might be willing to charge less or work harder. In some places, you couldn't hire white workers even if your business grew large enough to need help, because the sight of a white person working for a black person violated the natural order of things. If you were good at what you did, if you prospered even modestly, you attracted attention and resentment. A free black person with a nice coat or a well-built house was an offense against the entire ideology of white supremacy, a living argument that black people could thrive if given half a chance. And making that argument too loudly could get you killed. Let's talk about the guardian system. because this was one of the more insidious mechanisms of control. In many southern states, free black people were required to have a white guardian, essentially a sponsor who took legal responsibility for their behavior. This guardian could be a former enslaver, a sympathetic white friend, or simply someone willing to take on the role for a fee. Without a guardian, you might not be able to conduct business, sign contracts, or even remain in the state. The guardian had power over you that looked uncomfortably like ownership. They could restrict your movements, control your finances, and in some cases hire you out to other white people and keep the wages. If your guardian died, moved away, or simply decided they didn't want the responsibility anymore, you were suddenly unmoored, scrambling to find someone else willing to take on a role that most white people found distasteful or simply not worth the trouble. The system transformed freedom into a kind of supervised parole, with white people serving as perpetual probation officers for the crime of the existing while black. And then there were the taxes. Free black people in the Antebellum South paid special taxes that white people didn't pay, essentially fines for the audacity of not being enslaved. Some states charged an annual head tax on every free black resident. Some required free black people to pay for their own registration, their own court appearances, their own documentation of a status that should have been self-evident. The money went into state coffers, or sometimes into the pockets of the officials collecting it, and the effect was to make free black life economically precarious even when work was available. You earned less than white workers, paid more in taxes and fees, faced restrictions on accumulating property, and lived one bad month away from disaster. Some free black people who fell behind on taxes or fees found themselves sold into slavery to cover the debt. Freedom, it turned out, had a price that came due annually, and if you couldn't pay, the state would find a way to reclaim what it had reluctantly granted. Here's something that kept free black people awake at night: kidnapping. The domestic slave trade was booming in the antebellum period, with enslaved people from the Upper South being sold to the cotton and sugar plantations of the Deep South at enormous profit. A healthy young black man could fetch over $1,000 at auction, a sum that represented years of wages for most white workers. A skilled craftsman might bring even more. Women of childbearing age were valuable for their labor and their potential to produce more enslaved workers. Children were investments in future labor. This created a powerful incentive for unscrupulous men to grab free black people off the streets, destroy their papers, and sell them into slavery hundreds of miles from anyone who might recognize them. Professional kidnappers operated throughout the South and even ventured into northern states to snatch victims. They worked alone or in gangs, sometimes with the cooperation of corrupt officials who would certify stolen people as legitimate property. They had networks of contacts, safe houses where victims could be held, forged documents that created paper trails of ownership. Some posed as legitimate slave traders. Others operated as outright criminals, grabbing people in the night and transporting them before anyone knew they were missing. The techniques were sophisticated because the profits were substantial, and the risks were minimal, given that a kidnapped person couldn't testify against their kidnappers. Once you were sold and transported, proving your free status became nearly impossible. You couldn't testify in court against white people. You had no papers because they'd been destroyed or confiscated. You were in a strange place where no one knew you, where no one had any reason to believe you over the white man who claimed to own you. Your word meant nothing against the bill of sale that some white man had fabricated. Even if you managed to get word to family or friends back home, what could they do? Travel hundreds of miles to testify in a court that didn't want to hear from them? Hire lawyers with money they didn't have? The system was designed to make recovery impossible. The stories of free black people who spent decades in slavery after being kidnapped, who sometimes never escaped at all, who died in bondage protesting to the end that they were free. These stories were common knowledge in free black communities. Parents warned children never to go anywhere alone. People traveled in groups when possible, hoping that numbers would discourage kidnappers looking for easy targets. Some simply never left their immediate neighborhoods, accepting a constrained life as the price of a safer one. The fear was constant, justified, and impossible to ever completely escape. Every stranger was potentially dangerous. Every journey was a risk calculation. The legal system offered little protection and considerable danger. Remember, you couldn't testify against white people. This single restriction undermined any possibility of justice. So if a white man beat you, robbed you, or burned down your house, you couldn't take the stand to describe what happened. You couldn't point at your attacker and say, "This is the man who did it." You couldn't present your side of the story to judge or jury. You needed a white witness willing to testify on your behalf. And white witnesses willing to testify against other white people on behalf of a black person were rare creatures, indeed. Those who did often faced social consequences, being labeled as race traitors or troublemakers, finding their own standing in the community damaged by association with your cause. The courts were staffed by white judges elected by white voters, interpreting laws written by white legislators, applying standards that assumed black inferiority as a given. White juries decided cases involving black defendants, and those juries generally believed that black people were inferior, that slavery was right and natural, and that free black people were a nuisance at best and a menace at worst. Getting justice in this system was like trying to win a game where the other side made all the rules and could change them whenever convenient. The dice were loaded, the deck was stacked, and the house always won. And if you were accused of a crime, heaven help you. Black defendants faced harsher sentences than white defendants for identical offenses. The presumption of innocence that supposedly governed American courts evaporated when the defendant was black. Juries were quick to convict and judges were quick to sentence. For minor offenses that would earn white people fines or short jail terms, black defendants might face years of labor, public whipping, or worse. Some free black people convicted of crimes were sold into slavery as punishment, their freedom forfeit over offenses that barely qualified as misdemeanors when committed by white people. The threat of the courtroom was another tool of control, another reminder that your freedom existed at the sufferance of a system designed to deny it. Let's talk about the constant threat of expulsion, because your right to remain in the state where you'd built your entire life was never secure. Throughout the Antebellum period, Southern states passed increasingly restrictive laws aimed at reducing the free black population. Some states required newly freed black people to leave within a certain period or face re-enslavement. Some prohibited free black people from other states from entering, trapping existing residents while preventing others from joining them. Some states periodically debated whether to expel all free black people entirely, sending them to Liberia or some other distant place, eliminating the troublesome reminder that black and free could exist in the same body. Even when these expulsion proposals failed to become law, the debates themselves sent a message. You were tolerated, not accepted. Your presence was a problem that white people were constantly trying to solve. The ground beneath your feet was never stable. The community you'd built, the business you'd established, the family you'd raised could be swept away by a single legislative session if the political winds shifted. Free black people lived with this uncertainty constantly, knowing that their status depended not on rights, but on the fluctuating tolerance of people who saw them as a mistake. Movement was particularly fraught. If you needed to travel, to visit family in another county, to deliver goods to a customer, to attend a funeral or a wedding, to seek work in a nearby town, you faced a gauntlet of checkpoints, both official and informal. You needed your papers, obviously, but papers were not always enough. You also needed to avoid attracting the attention of the slave patrols that roamed the roads looking for runaways. These patrols, called patty rollers in the vernacular of the time, had the authority to stop any black person, free or enslaved, and demand proof of status. The patrols were often poor white men, resentful of their own position at the bottom of white society, taking out their frustrations on people they considered beneath them. They had legal authority and no oversight. They could stop you, question you, search your belongings, examine your papers with illiterate scrutiny, and decide whether you looked like someone who should be out on the road. Being stopped by a patrol meant being questioned about where you came from and where you were going, why you were traveling, and who could vouch for you. It meant being searched for weapons, for stolen goods, for messages that might be passing between enslaved people. It meant sometimes being beaten even when your papers were in order, because the papers said you were free, but the patrol said you had a suspicious attitude. And who was the court going to believe? Your word against theirs wasn't even admissible as evidence. Some free black people simply stopped traveling, limiting their lives to a small radius where they were known, where local whites could vouch for them, where the danger of a random encounter with strangers was minimized. This meant turning down opportunities, missing family events, letting the world shrink to a size that felt manageable rather than the size it should have been. Others traveled only in groups, hoping numbers would provide some protection, hoping that witnesses might discourage the worst abuses. They traveled during daylight when possible, along known routes, carrying documentation of their destinations as well as their origins. Everyone knew someone who had been detained, beaten, jailed, or worse simply for being in the wrong place while black. The roads were not free, no matter what your papers said. The social isolation was grinding. You existed in a middle space that belonged to no one, neither fully free nor enslaved, neither accepted by whites nor entirely trusted by the enslaved. Enslaved people might view you with suspicion, wondering if you thought yourself better than them, wondering if you would use your relative freedom to help them or to distance yourself from their condition, wondering whose side you were really on when push came to shove. Some enslaved people resented free black people for enjoying privileges they were denied. Others admired and envied them. The relationships were complicated by the chasm of legal status that separated people who might otherwise have been natural allies. White people viewed you as a contradiction and a threat, a living refutation of everything they believed about race and destiny. Your very existence argued against the ideology that justified slavery, and that made you dangerous regardless of how carefully you conducted yourself. You couldn't socialize with white people as equals, obviously. The color line was absolute in social situations, policed by custom and violence. But your interactions with enslaved people were also constrained by law and circumstance. Marrying an enslaved person meant your children would be born into slavery, following the condition of the mother. That knowledge haunted every romantic relationship that crossed the line between free and enslaved. Love was insufficient protection against a legal system that didn't recognize black love as worthy of protection. Befriending enslaved people too publicly attracted scrutiny, since white people worried that free black people would spread dangerous ideas about freedom would help enslaved people escape, would foment the rebellions that slaveholders feared constantly. You had to be careful about who you talked to, how long you talked, what you were seen doing. Even innocent interactions could be interpreted as conspiracy. Some free black people owned enslaved people themselves, a fact that complicates any simple narrative about this period. Sometimes this ownership was a legal fiction to protect family members they couldn't otherwise free, a spouse or child purchased, but not manumitted because the law made manumission difficult or impossible. Sometimes it was genuine investment in the system that oppressed them. Free black people buying enslaved workers to run their businesses, participating in an economy built on bondage, because that was the only economy available. The moral compromises required to survive were constant and corrosive. You did what you had to do, and you tried not to think too hard about what that did to your soul. But the thinking came anyway, in quiet moments, in sleepless nights, in the face of your reflection. Now let's talk about family, because maintaining a family as a free black person in the antebellum South was an exercise in constant anxiety that would drive modern people to madness. If your spouse was enslaved, they could be sold at any moment, sent hundreds of miles away, and there was nothing you could do about it legally. You could beg, you could try to scrape together money to purchase them. You could appeal to the enslaver's sense of decency, if any existed. But in the end, they were property, and property could be disposed of as the owner saw fit. You might wake up one morning to find that your husband or wife had been sold overnight, that they were already on a wagon heading south, that you would never see them again as long as you lived. If your children were born to an enslaved mother, they were born enslaved regardless of your status, following the legal principle that children inherited the condition of the mother. You might have to watch your own children grow up in bondage, might have to see them working in fields or houses, might have to witness them being disciplined by enslavers who had no stake in their well-being. You might have to purchase your own children if you ever wanted them free, going to their legal owner with hat in hand, negotiating a price for flesh that you had helped create. You might have to see them sold away before you could accumulate enough money, shipped off to distant plantations while you stood helpless, their cries fading down the road. Some free black men worked for decades to purchase their wives and children, saving every penny, taking extra jobs, denying themselves comforts, only to see the prices rise faster than their savings. The enslaver might change their mind, might decide they wanted more money, might simply refuse to sell because they enjoyed the power of refusal. Some men finally succeeded, after years of effort, and then faced the realization that they now technically own their own family members, a legal relationship that twisted something sacred into something obscene. Manumitting purchased family members was itself complicated, sometimes requiring court approval, sometimes forbidden by law, sometimes triggering requirements that the freed person leave the state. The bureaucracy of bondage wrapped itself around families like chains, constraining even when it couldn't directly enslave. The emotional toll was immense. Every pregnancy was shadowed by fear about the child's status. Every birth was complicated by calculations of freedom and bondage. Every family gathering reminded you of who wasn't there, who might not be there next time, whose presence depended on the whims of white people who saw them as property. The anxiety never fully lifted. You couldn't plan for the future because the future was contingent on forces beyond your control. You loved knowing that love might not be enough to keep your family together. That knowledge sat in your chest like a stone, cold and heavy and impossible to forget. The church was supposed to be a refuge, and in some ways it was. Free black people in the antebellum South built their own congregations when they could, finding in religion a space where they could gather, sing, pray, and support each other. The church was one of the few institutions they could control, one of the few places where black leadership was possible, one of the few spaces where the constant performance of deference could be set aside, if only for a few hours. In church, a black man could be a deacon, a leader, a voice of authority. A black woman could sing without apology, could feel the Spirit move through her without worrying about white disapproval. The sanctuary was a space apart, and that apartness was precious. But even churches were regulated by the suspicious white gaze. Many states required that a white minister be present at all black religious gatherings, presumably to ensure that nothing seditious was being preached, that no plans for rebellion were being hatched beneath the cover of hymns. This white observer sat in judgment, listening for anything that might suggest resistance, anything that might need to be reported to the authorities. The presence poisoned the sanctuary, made even prayer feel supervised, turned worship into performance. Some states prohibited black churches entirely after Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, blaming religious gatherings for fomenting resistance, seeing in every prayer meeting a potential conspiracy. Turner had been a preacher, and his rebellion had terrified white Southerners into crackdowns that lasted for decades. Where independent black churches existed, they were watched, harassed, sometimes burned. Ministers were questioned about their sermons. Congregations were dispersed by patrols. The message was clear. Even your relationship with God had to be supervised by white people. Even your prayers were suspect. Even your hope for salvation needed to be approved by those who saw themselves as your earthly masters. Some free black people attended white churches, sitting in segregated sections, listening to sermons that told them slavery was divine will, that obedience was their highest calling, that their proper place was somewhere below the white people who claimed to be saving their souls. The spiritual nourishment such churches offered was thin indeed, mixed with poison, telling you that your condition was God's will, while your soul screamed that God wanted something better for all his children. Education was another battleground. Learning to read and write was dangerous, forbidden in some states, restricted in others, always viewed with suspicion by white authorities who understood that literacy was power. A literate black person could read abolitionist newspapers smuggled down from the North. They could write passes for escaping enslaved people, forging the documents that might mean the difference between freedom and capture. They could communicate ideas that threatened the entire system, could correspond with allies, could record the injustices they witnessed for posterity. So states made it illegal to teach black people to read, free, or enslaved, punishing teachers and students alike. Schools for free black children were closed by law or by mob. Their teachers, sometimes white abolitionists, and sometimes free black people themselves, were arrested, fined, driven out of town, occasionally beaten. Students were dispersed, their books confiscated, their dreams of education criminalized. The message was clear. Ignorance was the natural condition for black people, and any attempt to change that condition was a crime against the social order. Some free black people learned anyway, in secret sessions conducted in back rooms and woods, with books hidden beneath floorboards, with lessons whispered so quietly that neighbors wouldn't hear. Parents taught children late at night, by candlelight, risking everything for the knowledge that might someday set them free in ways that legal freedom couldn't achieve. The hunger for knowledge was strong enough to risk punishment, because education represented something beyond practical skill. It represented the assertion that black minds were as capable as white minds, that the ideology of inferiority was a lie, that freedom might someday mean more than just not being owned. Every letter learned was an act of rebellion. Every word read was a victory against a system designed to keep black people in darkness. Let's talk about what happened when things went wrong, because things went wrong constantly. A fire destroys your workshop, and you have no insurance, no savings, and no white guardian willing to extend credit. A recession hits, and the customers who tolerated you in good times find white craftsmen during hard times. A new law passes, and suddenly your occupation is restricted. Your residence is questioned. Your right to remain is challenged. You get sick, and there's no hospital that will admit you. No doctor willing to treat you. No safety net except whatever your community can provide. You grow old, and there's no pension, no retirement, no guarantee that you won't end your days in poverty no matter how hard you worked. The precariousness was exhausting. You could do everything right, follow every rule, defer to every white person, pay every tax, and still watch everything collapse because the system wasn't designed for you to succeed. It was designed to make you fail, to prove that free black people couldn't thrive, to justify either re-enslavement or expulsion as the only solutions to the problem of your existence. And through all of this, you watched the enslaved people around you and knew that their fate and yours were bound together. The same ideology that justified their chains justified your restrictions. The same fear that kept them in bondage kept you in this peculiar half-freedom. When enslaved people resisted, when they ran away or rebelled, the restrictions on free black people tightened. Every Nat Turner produced a wave of new laws aimed at all black people, free or enslaved, as if liberty itself were contagious and needed to be quarantined. You understood that your freedom, such as it was, existed only because it was useful to white people in some way, or because eliminating it would be more trouble than tolerating it. You were a pawn in a larger game, your status contingent on political calculations you couldn't influence, your future determined by debates in legislatures where you had no voice and no vote. Some free black people accumulated property anyway. Through skill, luck, and relentless work, they built businesses, bought land, even acquired wealth by the standards of their time. A few became genuinely prosperous, owning substantial property, employing workers, living in houses that rivaled those of middling white families. These success stories were remarkable precisely because they were so difficult, achieved against obstacles that would have crushed most people. But success brought its own dangers. A prosperous free black person attracted envy, resentment, accusations. White neighbors might claim that the property was acquired illegally, that the business competed unfairly, that something must be wrong because a black person couldn't possibly have earned what they had. Some successful free black people were driven out by mobs, their property destroyed, their years of work reduced to ashes. Others were cheated by white partners who knew that a black person couldn't testify against them in court. Still others simply disappeared, their fate unknown, their property absorbed by white neighbors who claimed it had been abandoned. The psychological weight of living this way was immense. You performed deference constantly, smiling when you wanted to scream, thanking people who insulted you, agreeing with opinions that denied your humanity. You learned to read white moods, to sense when danger was approaching, to make yourself small and unthreatening in situations where your size or confidence might be perceived as a challenge. You watched your words, knowing that the wrong comment to the wrong person could mean disaster. You watched your children, trying to teach them the survival skills they'd need, trying to prepare them for a world that hated them, without crushing the spirits that you wanted them to keep. The stress was constant. The vigilance was exhausting. The anger had nowhere to go except inward, where it curdled into something that had to be managed, controlled, hidden from the very people who caused it. And yet, free black people in the Antebellum South didn't just survive. They built communities. They established churches and mutual aid societies. They created schools where they could, educated their children in secret where they couldn't. They maintained family connections across distances and legal barriers. They preserved traditions and created new ones. They found joy where joy could be found, in music and food and fellowship, in the small pleasures that couldn't be taxed or regulated away. They resisted in ways large and small, helping enslaved people escape, harboring runaways, passing information along networks that white people never fully understood. They held onto dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. They insisted on their humanity in a society that denied it. That insistence, that stubborn refusal to accept the terms being offered, was itself a form of resistance, a daily rebellion against the ideology that said they shouldn't exist. The end came eventually. The Civil War erupted. The Confederacy rose and fell. Emancipation became law, and then constitutional amendment. Suddenly all black people were free, at least on paper, and the peculiar category of free black Southerners disappeared into a larger population facing different but related challenges. But the antebellum period left its marks. The restrictions, the humiliations, the constant danger, the survival strategies, all of it shaped communities and families for generations. The knowledge that freedom could be conditional, that rights could be taken as easily as given, that white tolerance was not the same as white acceptance. This knowledge passed down through families who had learned it the hard way. The vigilance didn't disappear when slavery ended. It couldn't. The dangers simply evolved into new forms. Jim Crow replacing the black codes, sundown towns replacing expulsion laws, police replacing slave patrols. The free black people of the antebellum South had learned to navigate a world that wanted them gone or subjugated, and that skill would be needed for a long time to come. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what it meant to be free in a land of slavery. Think about carrying papers that proved your humanity to people who denied it anyway. Think about building a life on ground that could shift beneath you at any moment. Think about loving people whose freedom you couldn't guarantee, raising children into a future you couldn't control. Think about the courage it took to simply exist, to wake up every morning and face another day of the obstacles designed to break you. The free black people of the antebellum South didn't choose their circumstances. They chose how to respond to them. They chose survival and community and resistance. They chose to treat each other as fully human even when the law and society said otherwise. They chose hope when despair would have been easier. That choice, made daily, made hourly, made in the face of everything that told them to give up, is what we remember tonight. Their freedom was compromised, constrained, constantly threatened, but it was theirs. They held onto it with everything they had, and eventually they expanded it to include everyone. Rest now and let their perseverance carry you into peaceful sleep. Let's start with geography, because geography explains almost everything about how the Gulag culture came to exist and why it survived when so many other African traditions in America didn't. The Sea Islands are a chain of barrier islands stretching along the Atlantic coast from the southern tip of North Carolina, down through South Carolina and Georgia, and into northern Florida. They're separated from the mainland by marshes, tidal creeks, and rivers that twist through the low country like veins through a body. In the colonial era, these islands were among the most isolated places in British North America. No bridges connected them to the mainland. The only way to reach them was by boat, navigating waterways that shifted with the tides, that could strand an unfamiliar traveler in plough mud that would swallow them to the waist. The isolation was a curse for the enslaved people brought there, cutting them off from any hope of escape to freedom. But it was also, paradoxically, a gift. Because that same isolation meant that white oversight was limited, that plantation owners often lived on the mainland and visited only occasionally, that the cultural space in which enslaved people lived was less policed than anywhere else in the American South. The rice that grew in these coastal marshes is why any of this happened. Rice cultivation requires specific knowledge, specific skills, specific technology that Europeans didn't possess. But the people of the rice coast of West Africa, the region stretching from present-day Senegal down through Sierra Leone, Liberia, and into Côte d'Ivoire, they had been growing rice for centuries. They knew how to build the dikes and canals that controlled water flow through the paddies. They knew when to flood the fields and when to drain them. They knew how to process the harvested grain using mortars and pestles and winnowing baskets that were virtually identical to tools still used in West African villages today. So the planters of the Carolina Low Country didn't just want enslaved Africans. They wanted specific enslaved Africans, people from the rice-growing regions who could teach them how to cultivate this lucrative crop. The advertisements in Charleston newspapers were explicit. Wanted, Africans from the Windward Coast, experienced in rice cultivation. This wasn't random. This was targeted human trafficking, selecting for cultural knowledge that would be exploited for profit. The result was a concentration of people from particular regions of Africa that was unusual in the Americas. Most enslaved populations in the New World were deliberately mixed, slaveholders believing that people who couldn't communicate with each other were less likely to rebel, less likely to maintain dangerous solidarities. But in the Low Country, economic incentives overrode these concerns. The plantations filled with people from similar cultural backgrounds, people who spoke related languages, who shared religious beliefs and social customs, who recognized each other as coming from the same broad region, even if they weren't from the exact same ethnic group. The Mende, the Temne, the Vai, the Kissi, the Kapele. These were the peoples who found themselves concentrated on the Sea Islands, bringing with them traditions that would blend and transform, but never completely disappear. Now imagine arriving on one of these islands in the 1700s. You've survived the Middle Passage, that nightmare journey across the Atlantic that killed so many of your fellow captives. You've been sold at auction in Charleston, inspected and purchased like livestock, your humanity denied by every aspect of the transaction. And now you're being transported by boat through winding waterways to an island that will be your prison for the rest of your life. The landscape is strange, but also familiar in unsettling ways. The heat, the humidity, the marshes and rivers, the palm trees swaying in the breeze, all of it echoes the coastal regions of West Africa you were stolen from. It's not home, but it rhymes with home in ways that both comfort and torment. The air smells of salt and mud and decay, the particular perfume of tidal marshland that anyone who has spent time in the Low Country would recognize. Herons stalk through the shallows, alligators sun themselves on the banks. The sounds of insects fill the air with a buzz that never quite stops. You're put to work almost immediately because rice cultivation is labor-intensive and the planters want returns on their investment. The work is brutal in ways that are hard to overstate. You stand in water up to your knees for hours at a time, planting rice seedlings, weeding the paddies, harvesting the mature crop. The water is warm and fetid, thick with mosquitoes that carry malaria and other diseases that will kill many of your fellow workers. The sun beats down relentlessly, and there's no shade in the open paddies. Your back aches from bending. Your hands blister and bleed. The overseers watch and punish anyone who slows down. This is the context in which Gula culture emerged, in the midst of suffering that should have destroyed any possibility of cultural continuity. And yet it didn't. Because in the evenings, in the quarters, in the spaces between work, people found ways to remember. Here's where the story becomes something more than tragedy. The task system used on low-country plantations was different from the gang labor system used in other parts of the South, and that difference shaped everything about how Gula culture developed and survived. Under the gang system, which dominated cotton plantations in the Deep South, enslaved people worked in groups from sunrise to sunset. Their pace, dictated by overseers, their time never their own. Under the task system, each enslaved person was assigned a specific amount of work to complete each day. A quarter acre of rice to hoe, a certain number of rows to plant, a defined quantity to harvest. Once that task was finished, your time was your own. This might sound like a small thing, but it was revolutionary in its implications. It meant that skilled workers who completed their tasks quickly had hours each day that belonged to them. A strong, experienced field hand might finish by early afternoon, leaving the rest of the day for other pursuits. It meant that families could garden, cultivating their own plots of land where they grew vegetables and raised chickens and pigs. It meant they could hunt in the forests and fish in the abundant waters surrounding the islands, supplementing the rations provided by planters with food they procured themselves. It meant they could raise livestock, accumulating small amounts of property that represented something like wealth in an economy that treated them as property themselves. Some enslaved people on the sea islands actually sold surplus produce and eggs and fish, earning cash that they saved for years, sometimes managing to purchase their own freedom or the freedom of family members. The task system wasn't designed as a kindness. Nobody was trying to make enslaved lives easier. It emerged because rice cultivation required careful, skilled labor that couldn't be rushed without damaging the crop. The flooding and draining of paddies had to happen at specific times. The seedlings had to be planted at correct depths and spacing. The harvest had to be timed precisely. Rushed, sloppy work would ruin the crop and cost the planter money. So the planters found it more profitable to assign tasks and let workers complete them at their own pace than to force gang labor that produced inferior results. The economic logic was entirely selfish, but the unintended consequence was the creation of a semi-autonomous cultural space that existed nowhere else in enslaved America. In the evenings, after the tasks were done, in the quarters where the enslaved people lived, a different world came to life. This was where children learned the language their parents spoke. Not just English, but the Creole tongue that blended English words with African grammar and meaning. This was where elders told stories, tales that had traveled across the Atlantic in the memories of the stolen, transformed by new circumstances, but recognizable in their structures and morals. This was where young people learned crafts from their parents and grandparents, the basket weaving and wood carving and textile arts that connected them to ancestors they would never meet. This was where religious practices unfolded, the ring shouts and prayer meetings and rituals that maintained spiritual connections to Africa and to each other. The quarters were crowded and rough, the cabins small and poorly built, but they were also spaces of community and culture, places where being Gula meant something specific and valuable. The language that emerged in this space is one of the most remarkable features of Gula culture. And understanding it helps you understand how deeply African the Gullah remained even after generations in America. It's not simply English with an accent, despite what outsiders assumed for centuries. It's a Creole language, a fusion of English vocabulary with grammatical structures drawn from various West African languages. The way verbs are conjugated, the way sentences are constructed, the way meaning is conveyed through tone and rhythm, all of it reflects African linguistic patterns layered onto English words. When a Gullah speaker says, "Eda go da market," meaning he is going to the market, the grammar follows patterns found in Menda and other West African languages, not English grammar. When they say, "Dem chillin' da play," the plural marker dem and the continuous aspect marker da come directly from African linguistic traditions. The language wasn't a corruption of English, despite what white observers claimed. It was a creative synthesis, a new tongue born from the collision of worlds that allowed people from different African ethnic groups to communicate while preserving deep structures of African thought. The vocabulary of Gullah included hundreds of words borrowed directly from African languages, words that have sometimes passed into wider American usage without anyone knowing their origins. Bukra, meaning a white person, comes from the Efik and Ibibio languages of Nigeria. Kuta, the common low-country word for turtle, traces back to the Bambara and Malinka languages of West Africa. Guba, which became the American word for peanut, comes from the Congo word nguba. Gumbo, the name for both the vegetable okra and the stew made from it, derives from the Bantu word for okra. Tote, meaning to carry, comes from Kikongo and has spread into general American English. The Gullah were walking lexicons of African linguistic survival, their everyday speech carrying words that had crossed the Atlantic in the mouths of the stolen and taken root in American soil. For generations, white people dismissed Gullah as broken English, as evidence of intellectual inferiority, as something to be ashamed of and educated away. Teachers punished children for speaking Gullah in school. Employers refused to hire people who couldn't speak proper English. The message was clear. The way you talk marks you as ignorant, as backward, as less than. The speakers themselves sometimes internalize this shame, learning to code switch between Gullah at home and English in public, teaching their children to hide their native tongue, saving the language for family, for trusted friends, for the spaces where white judgment didn't reach. This linguistic shame was a form of cultural violence, an attempt to erase something precious by making people embarrassed to possess it. But linguists who actually studied Gullah discovered something that should have been obvious from the start. It was a fully functional language with consistent grammatical rules, expressive capacity, and a rich vocabulary perfectly suited to the lives of the people who spoke it. Lorenzo Dow Turner, a black linguist from Howard University, conducted groundbreaking research in the 1930s and 1940s, recording Gullah speakers, analyzing their language, and demonstrating definitively its connections to African tongues. He found thousands of personal names, words, and phrases that could be traced directly to specific African languages. His work, published as Africanisms in the Gullah dialect in 1949, validated what Gullah speakers had always known deep down. Their language was not degraded English, but a legitimate tongue with roots that reached across the ocean to the homelands their ancestors had been stolen from. The spiritual traditions that survived on the Sea Islands were equally remarkable, representing one of the most complete retentions of African religious practice anywhere in the Americas. The ring shout is perhaps the most dramatic example, a form of worship that combines music, movement, and religious ecstasy in ways that trace directly back to West African practice. Participants form a circle and move counterclockwise, shuffling their feet in a pattern that carefully avoids crossing, because crossed feet would make it dancing rather than worship, and dancing was forbidden in many Christian contexts. The distinction might seem like a technicality, but it was a brilliant adaptation that allowed African movement traditions to continue under the guise of acceptable Christian practice. The movement builds in intensity as singers chant call and response patterns, the rhythm driven by hand claps and stick beats on the floor. The songs are called shouts, and the singing is called shouting, though it's as much chanting as singing in the conventional sense. The shout could go on for hours, participants entering trance states that connected them to the spirit world, their bodies moving in patterns their ancestors would have recognized. The counterclockwise direction was significant, mirroring practices documented in West African religious ceremonies. The call and response structure echoed African musical traditions. The building intensity, leading to altered states of consciousness, paralleled ecstatic religious practices across the African diaspora. When observers first witnessed ring shouts on the Sea Islands during the Civil War, they described them with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, recognizing that they were seeing something ancient and powerful, something that had survived the Middle Passage and generations of bondage. This wasn't something that developed after slavery. It was already old by then, already woven into the fabric of community life, already essential to how the Gullah understood their relationship to the divine. The religious world of the Gullah was a complex blend of Christianity and African belief that scholars call syncretism, though that word doesn't quite capture the seamless integration the Gullah achieved. They attended church, sang hymns, learned Bible stories, and professed Christian faith with genuine conviction. The Christianity offered by missionaries provided a vocabulary for expressing spiritual truths, stories of liberation that resonated with enslaved people, and a promise of ultimate justice that made present suffering bearable. But beneath and alongside this Christianity flowed currents of African spirituality that never fully disappeared, that blended so thoroughly with Christian practice that separating them became impossible. Root doctors practiced healing arts that combined herbal medicine with spiritual intervention, using knowledge passed down through generations. They knew which plants cured which ailments, knowledge that had crossed the Atlantic and adapted to American flora. But they also knew that some illnesses had spiritual causes, that enemies could work roots against you, that protection required both physical remedies and spiritual interventions. A root doctor might prescribe an herb tea alongside a protective charm, might diagnose both a physical ailment and a spiritual attack, might treat the body and the soul as the interconnected whole that African philosophy understood them to be. Protective charms called hands or mojos were carried to ward off evil spirits and bring good luck. These small bundles of roots, bones, and other objects held power that believers took seriously, power to protect, to attract love, to ensure success. The Platai, a malevolent spirit that could appear in various forms to terrify or harm the unwary, was universally feared. It might appear as an animal, as a person, as something indescribable that lurked at crossroads and in dark places. Travelers at night took precautions against encountering Platais. Stories of encounters circulated through the community, serving both as entertainment and as warnings about the dangers of the spirit world. The dead were buried with broken possessions so their spirits could use them in the afterlife, a practice with clear parallels in West African funerary traditions. Mirrors were covered when someone died, so the departing spirit wouldn't be trapped. Bodies were carried out feet first, so the spirit wouldn't find its way back. The line between the living and the dead was thin and permeable, and proper respect for ancestors was essential for maintaining harmony between the worlds. Let's talk about the crafts, because material culture survives in ways that oral tradition sometimes doesn't, and the Gula preserved remarkable skills that linked them directly to Africa across centuries and thousands of miles of ocean. The sweetgrass baskets of the Low Country are the most famous example. Coiled baskets made from sweetgrass, bulrush, and palmetto fronds, sewn together with strips of palm leaf, in a technique that requires skill, patience, and knowledge passed from one generation to the next. The technique is identical to basket-making traditions in Senegal and Sierra Leone, not similar, not influenced by, but actually the same method that women in West African villages use today. The coiling technique, the materials, the shapes, the purposes, all of it connects the Gula basket makers to their African ancestors through an unbroken chain of teaching and learning. These weren't just beautiful objects, though they are beautiful. The tight coils forming patterns that catch light and shadow. The natural materials giving each basket a unique character. They were functional tools essential to rice cultivation, used for winnowing the grain, separating the edible kernels from the chaff. The fanna baskets, used in the Low Country rice fields, were the same design, made with the same technique, as baskets used in the rice paddies of West Africa. The enslaved women who made them were practicing a skill their grandmothers had practiced, their great-grandmothers, going back generations to a time before the slave ships came. Every basket was a connection to that past, a demonstration that the knowledge had survived, that the hands still knew what to do even after everything else had been taken. When you see a Gullah woman selling sweetgrass baskets at a roadside stand outside Charleston today, you're seeing a tradition that has survived 4 centuries and crossed an ocean. The baskets have become expensive art objects now, collector's items that can sell for hundreds or even thousands of dollars. But they're still made the same way, still using materials gathered from the Low Country marshes, still passed down from mother to daughter in family traditions that stretch back to Africa. The basket makers are cultural custodians, keeping alive a skill that connects them to ancestors they never met, demonstrating through their work that some things cannot be destroyed no matter how hard the circumstances try. Other crafts survived as well, though none as completely as the baskets. Wood carving traditions produced walking sticks and grave markers with designs that echoed African prototypes. Net making for fishing used techniques with African origins. Textile traditions, though disrupted by the availability of manufactured cloth, survived in quilting patterns and clothing styles that reflected African aesthetics. The Gula made beauty from whatever materials were available, and the forms that beauty took carried memories of the places their ancestors came from. The food traditions were equally persistent, so much so that the cuisine of the Low Country, which has become fashionable in recent decades as Southern cooking or soul food, is in many ways Gula cuisine, which is in many ways African cuisine adapted to American ingredients and circumstances. Rice was central, of course, served at almost every meal, prepared in ways that would be familiar to anyone from the rice coast of West Africa. The Gula cooked rice so that each grain stood separate, fluffy rather than sticky, using techniques that required practice to master. They made rice breads and rice puddings and rice fritters. They combined rice with beans and vegetables and bits of meat in one-pot dishes that stretched limited resources into satisfying meals. Rice wasn't just food. It was identity, a daily practice that connected them to the crop their ancestors had cultivated for centuries, the crop that had been the reason they were brought to these islands in the first place. Okra, a vegetable indigenous to West Africa, appeared in gumbos and stews and fried dishes, its mucilaginous texture thickening liquids in ways that took getting used to, but became essential to the cuisine. Beni seeds, which we now call sesame, came from Africa and were cultivated in gula gardens for their oil and their distinctive nutty flavor. They appeared in cookies and candies, in sauces and seasonings, a taste of home that had somehow survived the crossing. Black-eyed peas, eaten on New Year's Day for luck throughout the South, were an African crop, and the gula prepared them in traditional ways that had traveled across the Atlantic. Hoppin' John, that iconic low-country dish of rice and black-eyed peas, is essentially African in its conception, a combination of ingredients and flavors that could have come from the rice coast. The one-pot rice dishes that became low-country staples reflected West African cooking traditions where rice was combined with whatever vegetables and proteins were available. Chicken purloo, shrimp and rice, red rice cooked with tomatoes. All of these dishes had African roots that the gula maintained and adapted. The cooking techniques mattered too. The slow simmering that allowed flavors to meld, the layering of ingredients at different stages of cooking, the use of smoked meats and fish to add depth. Even the cooking implements, the large cast iron pots that every gula kitchen possessed, echoed the communal cooking pots of African villages. When you eat at a gula restaurant today, when you taste the flavors of the Low Country, you're tasting history, a history that began in Africa and survived against all odds on the sea islands of Carolina and Georgia. The isolation that preserved these traditions began to break down after the Civil War, but in ways that were both harmful and helpful to gula cultural continuity. When Union forces captured the sea islands early in the war, in November 1861, the white planters fled to the mainland in panic, leaving behind the enslaved population and the land they had worked for generations. Suddenly, almost overnight, the gula found themselves in a peculiar position, technically free, living on abandoned plantations, with no clear authority over them and no clear idea of what would happen next. The Port Royal experiment, as it came to be known, was one of the first attempts to transition from slavery to freedom, a testing ground for ideas about what emancipation might look like. Northern missionaries and teachers flooded the islands, bringing education and Christianity and new economic arrangements. They established schools where gula children learned to read and write, often for the first time in their family's history. They preached in churches, bringing their own brands of Christianity that sometimes conflicted with the syncretic faith the gula had developed. They tried to organize labor, to teach former slaves to work for wages, to prepare them for citizenship in a nation that wasn't sure it wanted them as citizens. Some of these northerners documented gula culture with genuine curiosity and respect. They recorded songs and stories, described customs and beliefs, left accounts that historians still rely on today. Charlotte Fortin, a black teacher from Philadelphia, kept a diary that provides invaluable glimpses into gula life during this transitional period. Others among the missionaries tried to stamp gula culture out as primitive, as obstacles to progress, as remnants of heathenism that needed to be replaced with proper civilization. They attempted to replace gula language with proper English, correcting children's speech, punishing those who slipped into their native tongue. They tried to replace African-influenced religion with respectable Protestantism, discouraging the ring shouts and the spiritual practices they found disturbing or incomprehensible. They tried to replace traditional practices with modern ones, assuming that their ways were better simply because they were northern, because they were white, because they came from places that seemed more advanced. The cultural imperialism was well-intentioned in some cases, cynical in others, damaging regardless of intent. The Gula people navigated these pressures as they had navigated everything else, adopting what seemed useful, resisting what felt like erasure, maintaining core traditions while adapting to new circumstances. They learned to read and write, skills that opened new possibilities and new forms of resistance. They accepted Christianity more fully, but on their own terms, maintaining the ring shouts and the spiritual practices that the missionaries wanted them to abandon. They worked with the new economic systems, but also maintained their own gardens, their own fishing, their own ways of providing for themselves outside the wage economy. They became skilled at presenting one face to outside observers while maintaining another among themselves, a survival strategy that Black Americans would perfect over the coming century. The land itself became a contested resource in ways that continue to echo today. Some Gula families managed to purchase land during and after the war, taking advantage of tax sales and government programs to acquire ownership of the ground their ancestors had worked as slaves. This land ownership became the foundation of Gula independence, providing economic security and a physical place where Gula culture could be practiced and preserved. The Penn School on St. Helena Island, founded by Northern missionaries, became an important institution for education and community development, evolving over the decades into a center for Gula cultural preservation. But land tenure was often complicated, held in common by families without clear individual titles, passed down through generations according to Gula custom rather than American law, vulnerable to legal challenges that would become more serious as the islands became more valuable to outside developers. The story of Gula land loss in the 20th and 21st centuries is its own tragedy, a slow-motion dispossession that continues today. As the sea islands became more accessible, as bridges replaced ferries and roads replaced paths, the very isolation that had protected Gula culture disappeared. Developers discovered that barrier islands made excellent resorts, that wealthy outsiders would pay premium prices for waterfront property, that land the Gula had owned for generations was worth fortunes in the new economy of tourism and retirement communities. The heirs property system that had worked for Gula families became a vulnerability. When land was owned collectively by dozens of family members, as it often was after generations of inheritance, any single heir could force a sale, and developers learned to seek out those willing heirs, to buy their shares and then petition courts to partition the property. Families who had lived on the same land for a century found themselves displaced by legal proceedings they didn't fully understand. Their inheritance converted to cash that disappeared while the land passed to strangers. Hilton Head Island is perhaps the most dramatic example. In the 1950s, it was a Gula community, home to families who had been there since slavery times, who farmed and fished and lived according to traditions their ancestors had established. By the 1970s, it was becoming a resort destination. Golf courses and gated communities spreading across land that had once grown cotton and rice. The Gula families were pushed to the margins, their property taxes rising as land values increased, their communities disrupted by development, their way of life increasingly impossible to maintain. Some held on, maintaining small enclaves amid the resort sprawl. Others left, seeking opportunities elsewhere, carrying their culture with them, but losing their connection to the specific place where it had developed. The pattern repeated across the sea islands, each bridge and each development project eroding the geographic foundation of Gula culture. but the culture persisted despite everything. The 20th century saw a gradual awakening of interest in Gullah traditions, both from within the community and from outside scholars. Lorenzo Dow Turner, a black linguist from Howard University, published a groundbreaking study of Gullah in 1949 that demonstrated definitively its connections to African languages. His work validated what Gullah speakers had always known, that their language was not degraded English, but a legitimate tongue with deep roots. Folklorists collected stories, songs, and customs before they could be lost. Community organizations formed to preserve and promote Gullah heritage. The Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, established by Congress in 2006, recognized the national significance of this cultural tradition and provided resources for its preservation. Today, the Gullah Geechee people number somewhere between 200,000 and 500,000, depending on how you count and who you ask. They live on the Sea Islands and the coastal mainland, in cities like Charleston and Savannah, and scattered across the country in diaspora, communities that maintain connections to home. The language is endangered but not dead, still spoken by older community members, being taught to younger generations in cultural programs and schools. The traditions continue, adapted to modern life but still recognizable. Sweetgrass baskets are sold to tourists, but they're also made for community use. The techniques passed from mother to daughter, as they have been for centuries. The ring shout is performed at cultural festivals and in church services. The same movements that enslaved people practiced in secret, now celebrated openly as heritage. The cuisine has become fashionable. Gullah restaurants and cookbooks introducing wider audiences to flavors that were always there waiting to be discovered. The story of the Gullah people is often told as a story of preservation, of holding on to African traditions against all odds. And that's true, but it's not the whole truth. The Gullah didn't simply preserve African culture like insects trapped in amber. They created something new, a culture that was African and American and entirely its own, forged in the specific conditions of the Low Country, shaped by the particular mix of peoples and circumstances that came together on the Sea Islands. The language wasn't any single African language. It was a Creole that emerged from contact between speakers of many tongues. The religion wasn't pure African spirituality. It was a synthesis that incorporated Christianity while maintaining African elements. The foodways combined African and American ingredients in new combinations. The Gullah were creative as well as conservative, innovators as well as preservers, building something that had never existed before while honoring what had come before them. What makes the Gullah story unique is not just what they preserved, but how they preserved it. In most of enslaved America, African cultural elements survived in fragments, in scattered practices and half-remembered traditions, in rhythms and flavors that echoed Africa without maintaining conscious connection to it. The Gullah maintained something more comprehensive, a whole way of life that remained recognizably African in its deep structures, even as it adapted to American circumstances. The reasons were geographical, demographic, and economic. The particular combination of isolation, concentrated population from related African regions, and the task system that created space for cultural autonomy. But the reasons were also human. The deliberate choices of people who decided that remembering mattered, that teaching the children mattered, that maintaining the language and the stories and the practices was worth the effort even when everything around them encouraged forgetting. The elders who kept the traditions alive deserve recognition that they rarely received during their lifetimes. The women who wove baskets and taught their daughters to weave. The men who told stories at night, passing down tales that mixed African folklore with American experience, the root doctors who maintained knowledge of plants and spirits, the church mothers who led the ring shouts and remembered the old songs, the cooks who prepared rice the way their grandmothers had prepared it, who knew that certain dishes required certain techniques that couldn't be shortcut. These people were cultural warriors, engaged in a form of resistance that was quieter than rebellion, but no less important. They ensured that when their great-grandchildren wanted to know where they came from, there would be something to find. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about what it means to carry a culture across an ocean and through centuries of oppression. Think about the enslaved people who arrived on the sea islands, speaking languages their captors couldn't understand, practicing religions their captors considered savage, carrying skills and knowledge that their captors exploited without respecting. Think about the choices they made in the margins of their bondage, the time they carved out to maintain what mattered, the traditions they passed to children who passed them to their children. Think about the language that survived, the words that crossed the Atlantic hidden in the mouths of the stolen, planted in new soil and growing into something that connected past and present. Think about the baskets woven from sweetgrass, each coil a link in a chain stretching back to Africa, each basket a statement that this knowledge will not be lost. The Gullah story is ultimately about the persistence of humanity in circumstances designed to deny it. It's about the ways that people create meaning, even when they're told their meanings don't matter. It's about the power of culture to sustain communities through the unsurvivable, to provide identity and continuity when everything else has been stripped away. The enslaved people of the sea islands were not supposed to maintain their languages or their religions or their traditions. They were supposed to become blank slates, empty vessels filled only with labor for their master's profit. They refused. Through countless small acts of remembering and teaching and practicing, they refused. And their refusal echoes down to the present, in the Gullah communities that still exist, in the traditions that still continue, in the culture that survived against all odds and continues to survive. So rest now, and let the rhythm of the Gullah story carry you toward sleep. Think of the tidal creeks winding through the marshes, the sweetgrass swaying in the salt breeze, the sound of voices speaking a language that bridges continents and centuries. Think of the ring shout spinning counterclockwise under southern stars, the same movement that spun in West African villages before the ships came. Think of the rice fields that demanded so much suffering but also created the conditions for so much survival. The Gullah found a way, against geography and economics and violence and time itself. They found a way, and they're still finding it, still teaching the children, still weaving the baskets, still cooking the rice, still speaking the words that their ancestors spoke. That persistence is what we honor tonight. That persistence is what carries us into peaceful sleep. Let's start with how you ended up in this situation, because understanding convict leasing requires understanding how the system created convicts out of free people. The Civil War ended slavery, but it didn't end the need for cheap labor, especially in the South, where the entire economy had been built on forced work. The plantation owners, the industrialists, the men who ran the mines and built the railroads, they needed bodies to do the work, and they weren't willing to pay fair wages to get them. So they found another way. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as punishment for crime. That exception became a loophole large enough to swallow hundreds of thousands of black lives. The Black Codes came first, laws passed across the South immediately after the war that criminalized ordinary behavior when black people did it. Vagrancy laws made it a crime to be unemployed, which meant any black man without a white employer vouching for him could be arrested. The definition of vagrancy was flexible enough to catch almost anyone. Walking on railroad tracks, speaking too loudly, being out after dark, not having proof of employment, looking suspicious to a white person who felt like calling the sheriff. If you couldn't prove you had a job, you were a vagrant. If you left a job without permission, you were a vagrant. If you were between jobs, you were a vagrant. The law was designed to catch you no matter what you did. Other laws targeted behaviors that weren't crimes at all when white people did them. Gambling was illegal, but only enforced in black communities. Changing employers without permission became a criminal offense. Speaking disrespectfully to a white person could get you arrested. Being present at a place where a crime allegedly occurred made you an accomplice. The creativity was almost impressive, if it weren't so evil. They invented crimes specifically to arrest black people, and then they leased those prisoners to private companies who needed workers. The arrest was the first step in a process designed to turn free people into slaves by another name. The courts were part of the machinery, not a check on it. Judges were elected by white voters who wanted black labor controlled. Sheriffs earned fees for each arrest, which meant they had financial incentives to arrest as many people as possible. Lawyers cost money that most black defendants didn't have, so they faced trial without representation. Juries were all white because black people couldn't serve. The trials themselves were formalities, lasting minutes, the verdict predetermined, the sentence whatever the labor market demanded. If the mines needed workers, sentences got longer. If the railroads were behind schedule, more people got arrested. The justice system wasn't just compromised by racism. It was operated as a labor recruitment mechanism, kidnapping people under color of law. Now imagine you're one of the arrested. You are walking down a road in rural Alabama, maybe heading to visit family, maybe looking for work, maybe just existing as a black man in a place where existing was enough to make you suspicious. A deputy stops you, asks for your papers, asks where you're going, asks questions designed to trap you no matter how you answer. You don't have documentation because you've never needed it before, because freedom was supposed to mean not needing a pass to walk down a public road. But that's not how it works anymore. You're arrested for vagrancy, hauled before a judge the next morning, convicted in a proceeding that lasts less than 5 minutes, and sentenced to a term that might be months or might be years. The sentence isn't really about the alleged crime. It's about how much labor someone is willing to pay for. The leasing happens fast. The state doesn't want to house prisoners, doesn't want to feed them, doesn't want to spend any money on people it considers worthless. Private companies bid for the right to lease convicts, paying the state a fee per prisoner per day. The highest bidder wins, and you become their property for the duration of your sentence. The mining companies are the hungriest buyers, always needing more workers for the dangerous, deadly work of extracting coal from Alabama's hills. Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, Pratt Coal and Coke Company, Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron Company. These corporate names become synonymous with suffering. They pay the state, and the state delivers you to the mines. And what happens after that is nobody's concern except the company that now owns your labor. You're transported to the mining camp in chains, along with dozens of other men who've been swept up by the same system. Some of them are actual criminals, men who committed real offenses, but many are like you, arrested for nothing, convicted of existing. The camp appears through the trees, a collection of wooden buildings surrounded by fences, guards with rifles watching from towers. It looks like a prison, because it is a prison, a private prison operated for profit, where the only measure of success is how much coal comes out of the ground and how little it costs to extract. You're marched to the processing area, stripped of your clothes, given a uniform that's already stiff with the sweat and blood of previous wearers, assigned a number that will be your identity for as long as you survive. The mine itself is a hole in the earth, a shaft descending into darkness, into heat, into an underworld that will become your entire existence. The coal seams in Alabama run deep, and the companies have been chasing them for years, tunneling further and further from the surface, creating labyrinths that stretch for miles underground. The entrance is a rectangle of darkness set into the hillside, tracks running into it for the coal cars, a steady stream of men going in and coming out, though not always the same men. The smell hits you before you enter, a mixture of coal dust, sweat, mule dung, and something else, something you'll later recognize as fear. The men around you move with the shuffling gait of exhaustion, their faces black with coal dust, their eyes showing white, their bodies already broken by work that will eventually break you too. You descend into the mine for the first time, and the darkness swallows you. The shafts are lit by oil lamps that create pools of flickering light surrounded by absolute blackness. The walls press in, the ceiling sometimes so low you have to crawl, the air thick with dust that coats your lungs with every breath. The temperature rises as you go deeper, the earth's heat combining with the body heat of dozens of men working in confined spaces until the sweat pours off you constantly, soaking, clothes that never dry, creating conditions perfect for the skin diseases that will eventually cover your body. The noise is constant, picks striking rock, coal cars rattling on tracks, men shouting, mules braying, the earth itself groaning as tunnels are cut deeper into its body. Your job is to dig coal, to swing a pick for hours without stopping, to fill cars that will be hauled to the surface while you stay below, always below. The coal seam might be 3 feet thick, or it might be 6 inches, and when it's 6 inches, you work lying on your side, swinging the pick in an arc that barely clears your own body, the rock pressing down on you from above, the coal dust filling your mouth and nose with every breath. The work is done by lamplight, the small flame on your cap the only illumination, casting shadows that make the tunnel walls seem to move, that hide the dangers until they're on top of you. The quota is set by the company, and it's set high, higher than any reasonable person could meet consistently, but meeting it is mandatory. Each man is expected to mine a certain tonnage each day, and the cars are weighed when they reach the surface. Fall short and you're punished. Meet the quota and you're expected to exceed it tomorrow. The system is designed so that you're always behind, always in debt to the company, always one bad day away from the whip. Some men manage to meet quota by working every possible minute, by skipping meals, by pushing their bodies past every limit. Others form informal partnerships, helping each other fill cars, covering for men who are sick or injured, trying to protect the group from punishment that falls on individuals. The guards carry leather straps, wooden paddles, whatever implements of pain the camp boss prefers, and they use them liberally, not just for punishment, but for motivation, for entertainment, for the simple exercise of power over men who can't fight back. The whippings happen in front of everyone, the victim stripped and held down while the blows fall, the sound of leather on flesh echoing through the camp, the screams serving as warnings to everyone watching. A man might receive 20 lashes, 50 lashes, 100 lashes, the number depending on the offense and the mood of the guard administering the punishment. Some men die from whippings, their bodies unable to withstand the trauma, the skin flayed from their backs, the shock stopping their hearts. Their deaths are recorded as due to other causes or not recorded at all, the truth buried along with their bodies. The mines themselves are death traps in ways that go beyond the intentional cruelty. Coal mining is inherently dangerous, but the convict mines were worse than any free labor operation would have been allowed to be. Safety measures cost money, and the companies had no incentive to spend money protecting workers who could be replaced for the cost of another lease payment. Ventilation was inadequate, allowing methane gas to accumulate in the tunnels, creating conditions for explosions that could kill dozens at once. The Pratt Mines disaster of 1888 killed over 100 men when gas ignited deep underground, the explosion so powerful it blew bodies out of the mine entrance. So hot it fused coal and rock and flesh into indistinguishable masses. Roof supports were minimal, the timbers too few and too weak, the rock above groaning and cracking until it came down on the men below. The explosions were spectacular tragedies that occasionally made the newspapers, but the daily accidents killed more men over time. Cave-ins buried workers under tons of rock, sometimes killing them instantly, sometimes trapping them alive to suffocate slowly, while rescuers tried to dig through. Coal cars broke loose and rolled down inclines, crushing anyone in their path. Tools slipped and struck flesh. Men fell down shafts that descended hundreds of feet. The mules that hauled coal cars through the tunnels kicked and bit, injuring handlers who couldn't get out of the way in the cramped passages. Every day brought new injuries, new deaths, new reminders that the mine would take you eventually, that the only question was when and how. The hours are inhuman. You enter the mine before dawn and emerge after dark, spending your entire waking life underground, except for the brief periods of eating and sleeping. 14 hours, 16 hours, sometimes more during busy seasons when the company needs extra production. There are no days off, no weekends, no holidays. Sunday might bring a few extra hours of rest, or it might not, depending on the whims of the management and the demands of the market. Christmas and New Year's pass like any other days, marked only by the guard's mood, which might be slightly better or slightly worse than usual. You work until you can't work anymore, and then you're punished until you work again, and the cycle continues until your sentence ends or your body gives out. For many men, the body gives out first. The food is barely enough to sustain life, certainly not enough to sustain the brutal labor demanded. Cornmeal and fatback, day after day, the same meal morning and night, supplemented occasionally with beans or vegetables if the camp is well supplied. More often just the cornmeal mush and the rancid pork fat that provides the only calories the company is willing to spend. The portions are calculated to keep you alive and working, nothing more. Every calorie a cost that cuts into profits. A mining company that fed its convict laborers well was a mining company that made less money, and the whole point of the system was to make money. Men grow thin despite the physical labor that should have built muscle. Their bodies consume themselves, burning fat and then muscle to fuel work that demands more than the food provides. The hunger becomes a constant companion, a gnawing in your belly that never fully goes away, that wakes you at night, that makes you dream of food you'll never eat, that makes you think about food constantly, even when you should be thinking about the rock above your head that might come down at any moment. Some men steal from each other, desperate enough to risk the punishment that comes with getting caught. Some men catch rats and roaches, eating whatever they can find in the barracks, their bodies demanding fuel that the company won't provide. The guards don't care what you eat as long as you keep working. They don't care if you're starving as long as you can still swing a pick. The water situation is almost as bad as the food. The camps have wells or streams that provide drinking water, but the water is often contaminated, shared by men and mules alike, carrying diseases that spread through the population in waves. Dysentery is endemic, men losing control of their bowels, losing fluid their bodies can't afford to lose, weakening to the point where work becomes impossible and death becomes likely. The latrines are pits dug behind the barracks, overwhelmed by the number of users, breeding grounds for the flies that spread illness, stinking so powerfully that the smell reaches everywhere, that you can never fully escape it, that it becomes part of the background of your existence like the coal dust and the fear. The sleeping quarters are wooden barracks, rows of bunks stacked 3 high. Men packed so tightly that turning over means bumping the person next to you, that the body heat of dozens becomes overwhelming on summer nights, that the cold of winter seeps through walls that were never built to keep anything out. The mattresses are straw ticks, thin and infested with vermin, the straw flattened by use, until you might as well be lying on the wooden slats beneath. The blankets are inadequate, thin wool that might keep you comfortable in mild weather, but that can't fight the Alabama winter when it turns serious. In summer, the barracks become ovens, the heat trapped inside, the smell of unwashed bodies, overwhelming, the air so thick it's hard to breathe. In winter, men freeze, huddling together for warmth, waking to find frost on the inside of the walls, breathing out clouds that hang in the air. The lice and bedbugs are constant, crawling across your skin as you try to sleep, biting and itching and spreading diseases that will eventually kill some of your fellow prisoners. You can feel them moving on you, can hear them in the straw, can see them when you shake out your clothes in the morning. There's no way to get rid of them, no bathing facilities adequate to the task, no clean clothes to change into, no escape from the infestation that covers every surface and every body in the camp. The itching drives men half mad, scratching until they bleed, creating open sores that become infected, adding one more misery to the pile that already seems unbearable. Sleep is something you steal in fragments, never enough, never restful. Your body crying out for rest that the schedule won't allow. The guards are not bound by any law you would recognize. They can beat you for any reason or no reason. They can shoot you if you try to escape, and sometimes they shoot you even if you don't. They can withhold food, can extend sentences, can make your life significantly worse than it already is, and there's no one to appeal to, no oversight, no accountability. Some guards are simply cruel, men who enjoy inflicting pain, who sort out this work because it lets them hurt people without consequences. Others are indifferent, doing a job, viewing the prisoners as less than human, treating you the way they might treat a stubborn mule. Neither type sees you as a person. You're a unit of production, a machine that converts food into coal, valuable only as long as you keep producing. The death rate in the Alabama mines was staggering, so high that it shocked even people who were used to industrial accidents, even people who thought black lives were cheap. In some years, nearly half, the convict miners died. Not were injured, died. The Banner mine in Jefferson County recorded death rates that approached 45% in its worst years. The Pratt mines, which would later become part of the US Steel Empire, killed convicts at rates that would have been scandalous if the victims had been anyone who mattered to the people in power. The causes of death were various, and the records, when they exist at all, often obscure the truth. Cave-ins that buried men alive, the rock coming down without warning, trapping workers under tons of debris that might take days to clear, by which time The trapped men had suffocated or bled to death or simply died of thirst, waiting for rescue that came too late. Explosions of coal gas that incinerated entire work crews, the methane accumulating in poorly ventilated tunnels until a spark from a pick or a lamp set off a fireball that traveled through the shafts at the speed of sound, burning everything in its path, leaving bodies charred beyond recognition. Falls down shafts, tumbles from unstable platforms, collisions with coal cars, injuries from the mules that dragged equipment through the tunnels, the thousand ways that a dangerous environment could kill men who were already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. The diseases killed even more than the accidents. Tuberculosis was endemic, the coal dust shredding lungs with every breath, creating lesions where the bacteria could take hold. The cramped sleeping quarters ensuring that the disease spread from man to man until nearly everyone was infected. The TB came on slowly, a cough that got worse, a weakness that didn't go away, a fever that spiked and fell and spiked again, until finally you were coughing blood and couldn't work and were left to die in the camp hospital or wherever you happened to collapse. Pneumonia killed men weakened by overwork and underfeeding, their bodies unable to fight infections that healthy men might survive. Dysentery swept through, camps where sanitation was non-existent, dehydrating men to the point of death. Typhoid came with contaminated water. Smallpox came in waves. Every disease that preys on weakened immune systems found its way into the convict camps. And then there were the deaths that weren't accidents at all. The men who were beaten to death by guards who went too far. The men shot while allegedly escaping. The men worked until their hearts gave out. The men who simply disappeared from the records without explanation. The companies had no obligation to account for their workers the way they would have had to account for free employees. A dead convict was a financial inconvenience, a lease payment that had been wasted, but it wasn't a crime, wasn't an investigation, wasn't anything that required explanation. The bodies were buried in unmarked graves near the camps, often in the same mass trenches, often without any notification to families who didn't know where their relatives had been taken in the first place. The company doctors, when they existed at all, were there to get men back to work, not to heal them. A man who couldn't work was useless, a cost without a return. So the goal was always to return prisoners to the mines as quickly as possible, regardless of their actual condition. The doctor's examination was brief and brutal. Can you walk? Can you hold a pick? Can you produce coal? If the answers were yes, you went back to work. If the answers were no, you might get a day or two in the hospital ward, a cot in a room full of other broken men, before you were sent back anyway or left to die. Injuries that should have meant weeks of rest were treated with a day or two off before the man was sent back underground. Broken bones were splintered crudely and declared healed long before they actually were. Infected wounds were bandaged and ignored until the infection spread, until gangrene set in, until amputation became the only option. Diseases were treated with whatever patent, medicines the company had bought cheap, nostrums that did nothing, that might actually make things worse, that were given out to create the appearance of medical care without the expense of actual treatment. Men worked with broken bones, with infected wounds, with fevers that should have kept them in bed, with conditions that were slowly killing them, because the alternative was punishment that might kill them faster. Some doctors were simply incompetent, men who couldn't find work in legitimate medical practice, who took jobs in the convict camps because no one else would have them. Others were competent but constrained, understanding what their patients needed but unable to provide it, knowing that the company wouldn't pay for real treatment that advocating too strongly for prisoners' health would get them fired. A few were actively cruel, seeing the prisoners as less than human, experimenting with treatments, withholding care as punishment, participating in the system's cruelty rather than just tolerating it. The doctor's job was to determine whether you could still swing a pick, and if you could, you went back to the mine. If you couldn't, you might be sent back anyway. Your life was worth less than the coal you could produce. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical suffering. You had been a free man, with a name, a family, a life. Now you were a number, a commodity, a tool to be used until you broke. The humiliation was constant, the guards addressing you with slurs, the work stripping away every dignity, the conditions reducing you to an animal struggling to survive. Men lost hope, which was perhaps the most dangerous thing to lose, because hope was what kept you putting one foot in front of the other. Some men tried to escape, knowing the odds were against them, preferring the risk of being shot to the certainty of being worked to death. Most were caught and brought back, punished savagely, their sentences extended. A few made it, disappearing into the woods, making their way north, carrying stories that the rest of the country didn't want to hear. Some men chose death deliberately, a final act of agency in a world that had stripped them of all other choices. They walked into danger in the mines, or they attacked guards knowing they would be killed, or they simply stopped eating and let their bodies fade. The will to live can only sustain so much, and the camps tested that limit daily. The men who survived did so through luck as much as determination, through random chance that put them in the safer parts of the mine, that kept them out of the worst guard's sight, that spared them from the epidemics that killed their bunkmates. Survival wasn't something you earned through effort. It was something that happened to you, or didn't. The companies that ran these operations were not shadowy figures. They were pillars of Southern industry. Their executives respected members of society, their stockholders including some of the most prominent names in American business. Tennessee Coal, Iron and Railroad Company, was eventually bought by U.S. Steel, making one of the largest corporations in America complicit in the system. The profits generated by convict labor funded the industrialization of the South, built fortunes that still exist today, created the infrastructure that modern Alabama still uses. The coal that came out of those mines powered factories and heated homes across the country. The steel made from Alabama iron built bridges and buildings. The entire Southern industrial economy was subsidized by this system of neo-slavery. The costs externalized onto black bodies that nobody was counting. The leasing companies preferred black convicts, and the statistics show it clearly. While black people were a minority of Alabama's population, they were the vast majority of its convict laborers. The system wasn't colorblind. It was designed to catch black people specifically, to recreate the labor, arrangements of slavery under a new legal framework. White convicts existed, but they were often given different, less dangerous work, or they served shorter sentences, or they were leased to farms rather than mines. The mines were for black men, because black lives were cheaper, because black deaths didn't generate the kind of attention that white deaths might, because the whole system depended on a supply of laborers who could be used up and replaced without consequence. The families of convict laborers suffered terribly, often not knowing where their husbands or sons or brothers had been taken, often not learning of their deaths until months later, if at all. A man could be arrested in one county, tried in another, and shipped to a mine in a third, all without anyone notifying his family. The arrest itself might happen without witnesses, a man taken while walking alone, his family learning only when he failed to come home, searching for days or weeks before discovering that he was in custody, if they ever discovered it at all. Women showed up at jails looking for missing relatives, only to be told they had been leased out, with no information about where or for how long. The clerks who processed the paperwork didn't keep track of such details, or didn't care to share them, or actively enjoyed the suffering of families desperate for information. A wife might travel to 3 different counties looking for her husband, spending money she couldn't afford, only to learn that he had been sent to a mine she'd never heard of in a part of the state she'd never been to. By the time she found him, if she found him, he might already be dead. Children grew up without fathers, their families plunged into poverty by the loss of a breadwinner who had committed no real crime. The women left behind had to find ways to support themselves and their children in an economy that offered black women few options beyond domestic service, work that paid barely enough to survive, that required long hours away from home, that left children to raise themselves or be raised by neighbors and relatives. The economic devastation rippled outward from each arrest, affecting not just the man who was taken, but everyone who depended on him. The terror of the arrest extended beyond the man who was taken, spreading through communities, creating a constant fear that any black man might be next. Parents warned their sons to be careful, to avoid situations that might attract the attention of sheriffs looking for laborers, to never be caught alone, to never give anyone an excuse. But the excuses were so flimsy that avoiding them was impossible. You could be arrested for walking on a road. You could be arrested for sitting on a bench. You could be arrested for existing in a place where a white person wanted you removed. The fear was rational because the threat was real, and the fear itself was part of the system's function, keeping black communities afraid, keeping black workers compliant, making sure everyone understood who had power and who didn't. The reformers who tried to end convict leasing faced powerful opposition from every direction. The state government depended on the revenue the system generated, money that funded schools and roads and public services without requiring white taxpayers to pay higher taxes. Governors, who might have been sympathetic to reform, found themselves trapped by budgets that couldn't balance without the lease payments. Legislators who proposed changes found their bills killed in committee, their political careers threatened, their motives questioned. The system had become essential to the state's finances, and dismantling it would require finding new revenue sources that no one wanted to provide. The mining companies had political connections that protected their interests at every level of government. They contributed to campaigns, employed relatives of politicians, made themselves indispensable to the state's economic development. Their executives sat on boards with governors and senators, socialized with judges and prosecutors, belonged to the same churches and clubs as the men who made the laws. When journalists wrote exposés of the conditions in the camps, company representatives responded with denials and counterattacks, questioning the journalists' motives, dismissing the reports as exaggerations or northern propaganda designed to damage the South. When prisoners died in numbers that should have scandalized the nation, the deaths were explained away as the natural consequences of working with dangerous criminals, as if the men in the mines were hardened murderers rather than vagrants and petty offenders. The companies produced statistics showing that death rates in their operations were comparable to death rates in free mining operations. Statistics that were false, that required creative accounting, that compared convict mines to the most dangerous free operations rather than to industry averages. The lies were told confidently and repeatedly, and enough people believed them or pretended to believe them, that reform remained impossible for decades. Some prisoners testified when they got the chance, their words preserved in investigations that led to nothing. in court proceedings that changed nothing, in newspaper articles that were read and forgotten. They described the whippings in detail, the number of lashes, the implements used, the guards who administered them with obvious pleasure, the injuries that festered and became infected, the men who died from punishment that was supposed to correct behavior. They described men dying in the mines, crushed by rock, burned by explosions, worked until they collapsed, their bodies left where they fell until the shift ended. They described the hunger and the cold and the heat and the disease, the constant presence of death, the absence of hope, the feeling of being worked to death by a system that valued coal more than human life. Their words were recorded, filed away, used to generate brief moments of outrage that never translated into meaningful reform, and then forgotten until historians rediscovered them decades later. The system finally ended not because of moral awakening, but because of economic calculation. As the 20th century progressed, the convict leasing system became less profitable and more troublesome. Free laborers, including immigrants and poor whites willing to work for low wages, became available in larger numbers. The bad publicity surrounding convict deaths created occasional problems for the companies. Most importantly, the state realized it could extract even more value by using convict labor directly on public works projects rather than leasing it to private companies. Alabama formally ended convict leasing in 1928, one of the last states to do so, but it replaced the system with chain gangs and prison farms that continued many of the same abuses under different names. The men who survived the mines carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. The physical damage was obvious. Lungs destroyed by coal dust, bodies broken by labor, injuries that never healed properly. The psychological scars were less visible, but equally permanent. Nightmares that never stopped, an inability to trust, a flinching response to authority that made normal life difficult. Some men couldn't talk about what they'd experienced. Others couldn't stop talking about it, needing to witness, needing someone to know. Most died before anyone thought to record their stories in any systematic way, their experiences buried with them, the full truth of the convict leasing system, known only to those who lived it. The mines themselves are mostly abandoned now, shafts collapsed or sealed, the coal exhausted, or no longer profitable to extract. The camps where men suffered and died have rotted back into the earth, leaving few traces, no monuments, no acknowledgement of what happened there. The companies that profited have been renamed, merged, dissolved, their connection to convict leasing buried in corporate histories that prefer not to remember. The descendants of the men who died in those mines often don't know the full story of how their ancestors suffered, the records incomplete, the history deliberately obscured. But the system's effects echo forward through time in ways that are still being understood. The wealth extracted from convict labor-funded developments that shaped modern Alabama and the modern South. The patterns of incarceration established during the convict leasing era, the criminalization of black existence, the use of the justice system as a labor recruitment mechanism. These patterns didn't disappear when the leasing ended. They evolved, adapted, found new expressions in mass incarceration, in prison labor programs, in the ongoing overrepresentation of black Americans in the criminal justice system. The convict leasing system was not an aberration. It was a template. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, think about the men who descended into those mines, who swung picks in the darkness, who breathed coal dust until their lungs gave out. Think about Green Cottenham, whose story was documented in Douglas Blackman's book Slavery by Another Name, arrested for vagrancy in 1908, sold to a mining company, worked in conditions that killed so many others. Think about the thousands whose names we don't know, whose deaths weren't recorded, whose suffering generated the wealth that built industries and fortunes. Think about what it means that this happened in America, after emancipation, in a country that claimed to believe in freedom. But think also about the fact that some survived. Against odds that should have been insurmountable, some men made it through their sentences, walked out of the camps, returned to lives that would never be the same, but that were still lives. They carried witness even when no one wanted to hear. They told their children and grandchildren, kept the memory alive, refused to let the system erase itself completely. The convict leasing system tried to consume them entirely, to turn them into fuel for industry, to extract every bit of value and discard the rest. It failed. Not in the sense that it didn't cause immense suffering, because it did, but in the sense that it couldn't destroy the humanity of the men it tried to destroy. That persistence, that survival, that refusal to be completely erased is what we remember tonight. Let it carry you into peaceful sleep.